when Melania Trump decided to take legal action against Jasmine Crockett. The move surprised both her critics and supporters. Melania has always been seen as someone who chooses silence over conflict, often letting controversies pass without much public response. But in this case, her decision to step into the courtroom signaled that she believed the matter had gone too far. The lawsuit centered around remarks Crockett had made, remarks that, according to Melania, went beyond ordinary political criticism and crossed into territory that damaged her personal reputation. For Melania, this wasn't only about defending herself in the public eye, it was about drawing a clear line between political sparring and personal defamation. Her team argued that Crockett's words weren't just political rhetoric, but deliberate attempts to undermine her dignity and the legacy she had worked to build during her time as First Lady. For years, Melania had maintained a carefully composed image, poised, private, and focused on initiatives that she believed mattered, such as her Be Best campaign. She understood that public figures are often the subject of criticism, but in her view, Crockett's remarks carried an intent to inflict lasting harm. This was why she made the unusual step of filing suit. It was less about politics and more about protecting something deeply personal to her. The lawsuit itself immediately drew headlines, not just because of who was involved, but because of what it represented. In America, legal battles between political figures and public personalities often become proxy wars and broader cultural debates. Melania's action against Crockett was no different. Supporters of Melania argued that she had every right to demand accountability for what they described as reckless and disrespectful comments. Meanwhile, Crockett's supporters insisted that the Congresswoman was simply exercising her right to free speech, calling the lawsuit an attempt to intimidate or silence her critics. Inside the courtroom, the case was framed as a clash between reputation and expression. Melania's attorneys leaned heavily on the idea that words carry weight, especially when they come from someone holding public office like Crockett. They argued that Crockett, as a congresswoman, should have been aware of the influence her statements carried and the damage they could cause when directed at someone like Melania. To strengthen their argument, Melania's legal team presented past examples of how public comments had been used to tarnish her character, painting a picture of someone who had endured years of ridicule and false narratives. But it wasn't just about what was said. The lawsuit also tapped into broader questions of respect and public discourse. Melania's side suggested that Crockett's remarks reflected a growing disregard for civility in politics, and that if such behavior went unchallenged, it would encourage even more personal attacks against public figures. By bringing the lawsuit forward, Melania hoped not only to clear her own name, but also to set a precedent that public criticism has limits, even when aimed at individuals who live in the spotlight. On the other side, Crockett's defense prepared to argue that her comments fell within the boundaries of free expression, the same freedom that allows politicians and citizens alike to voice dissent. They insisted that Melania, as a former First Lady, was undeniably a public figure, and therefore, subject to scrutiny, commentary, and even sharp criticism. The tension between these two interpretations of rights, reputation versus free speech, set the stage for a legal showdown that quickly became larger than the two women themselves. For Melania, however, the decision to sue wasn't rooted in politics alone. Those close to her suggested that she felt personally betrayed by the harshness of Crockett's words, especially because they struck at aspects of her character and legacy she valued most. She had spent years carefully stepping around political fights, often staying quiet when others might have lashed out. Filing this lawsuit showed a rare willingness to confront an adversary head-on, signaling that Crockett's remarks had left a mark deeper than most. The case, in many ways, became a reflection of Melania's broader struggle to define how she would be remembered as First Lady. She often stood in the shadow of her husband's larger-than-life persona, yet she worked to create her own space, her own projects, and her own sense of identity. By suing Crockett, she was making a statement that her legacy wasn't for others to casually dismantle with words. She wanted the court to recognize that reputations are not disposable, and that personal dignity deserves protection, even in the turbulent world of politics. From the very beginning of the trial, it was clear that Melania Trump's legal team walked into the courtroom with a certain air of confidence. Their preparation showed in every detail: thick binders stacked neatly on the table, polished statements ready for delivery, and an opening argument designed to frame the case as an undeniable matter of personal harm. For them, the strategy seemed straightforward: prove that Jasmine Crockett's remarks had crossed the line from fair political critique into defamation, and use that proof to restore Melania's standing in the public eye. The lawyers began by outlining Melania's journey as First Lady, emphasizing how carefully she had curated her public image. They highlighted her initiatives, her charitable engagements, and her decision to avoid messy political spats. In their telling, Melania was someone who had worked tirelessly to separate herself from the mudslinging of modern politics, focusing instead on projects that promoted children's welfare and anti-bullying campaigns. Crockett's comments, they argued, had taken direct aim at this image. attempting to fracture the reputation she had built over years of careful effort. Each witness called early in the trial seemed to reinforce this narrative. Former advisors spoke of how Melania valued privacy and dignity, yet constantly endured public ridicule. Media experts testified about the long-lasting effects of negative press, especially when amplified by political figures. The attorneys tied it all together with the assertion that Crockett's words had tipped the scale from opinion into damaging falsehoods. For Melanian supporters watching the proceedings, it felt like her team had the upper hand. The early advantage also came from the tone set by Melanian's attorneys. They were calm, methodical, and avoided theatrics, presenting the case as one rooted in fairness rather than revenge. This approach gave them an air of credibility, as though they were simply asking the jury to recognize a basic truth: words can cause real harm. The lawyers framed Melania not as a political figure, but as a woman who had endured unjust attacks, a mother and former First Lady whose dignity had been carelessly disregarded. Even Melania herself contributed to this early advantage by the way she carried herself in court. She was poised and quiet, rarely reacting to anything said by the defense. Observers noted that her stillness projected a sense of composure, almost as if she were above the fray of politics. This demeanor helped support her lawyer's narrative. She wasn't there to fight a political battle, but to defend her personal honor. On the other side, Crockett and her team appeared more defensive in those opening hours. While they held firmly to their argument about free speech, the structure and polish of Melanian's case seemed to overshadow them at first. Crockett's legal counsel tried to stress the importance of open critique in a democracy, but the contrast between their urgency and Melanian's calm, methodical presentation made it seem as though they were on the back foot. Jurors leaned in more during the testimony, supporting Melania, nodding as witnesses spoke about reputational harm, giving the impression that her side had successfully captured their attention. The confidence of Melanian's team wasn't just about courtroom tactics, it reflected a broader belief in the strength of her claim. They pointed to precedents in defamation law, bringing up cases where public figures had successfully proven harm, despite the high legal bar set for such claims. By grounding their case in legal history, they added another layer of authority to their arguments. For those listening, it wasn't simply about whether they liked or disliked either woman, it was about whether the law recognized a limit to public criticism. In those early hours, it looked as if Melanian's legal team had set the stage exactly as they wanted. The jury was engaged. The press was reporting the trial as a strong move on her part, and even Crockett's supporters admitted privately that Melanian's lawyers had delivered a cleaner opening. For Melania, the beginning of the case offered a glimpse of validation that the courtroom could be a place where her dignity was acknowledged and protected, not mocked or disregarded. It was in that early advantage that her side believed they had found momentum. Each argument, each piece of evidence, and each testimony painted a picture of Melania as someone wronged and standing up for herself. Her lawyers had reason to believe that if things continued this way, the trial would lean heavily in her favor, setting her on course to achieve exactly what she had hoped for when she filed the lawsuit. The turning point of the trial arrived not with a dramatic speech or a lengthy cross-examination, but with the quiet, measured words of a single witness. Up until that moment, Melania Trump's legal team had built their case with precision, stacking testimony upon testimony to show that Jasmine Crockett's remarks had caused real harm. But when Crockett's side introduced their key witness, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted almost instantly. The witness, a former staffer, with a background in media communications and access to public records, walked calmly to the stand. There was no tension in his body language, no nervousness about the weight of the trial. He carried himself like someone who knew exactly what he had to say and how little time it would take to say it. While Melanian's lawyers prepared for a lengthy rebuttal, what came next stunned everyone watching. When questioned, the staffer presented evidence that directly challenged one of the central claims made by Melanian's legal team. In fewer than 9 seconds, through a combination of testimony and a single piece of documentation, he undercut the very foundation of their argument. The courtroom fell into silence, and even those in the gallery who had been shifting in their seats suddenly froze. The staffer had not raised his voice or delivered a fiery declaration. He simply laid out a fact so clearly that it was impossible to ignore. Melanian's attorneys, who had up until that point maintained an air of control, scrambled to reframe the situation. They tried to question the validity of the document, to poke holes in the testimony, but the damage was done. The staffer's calm explanation, backed by verifiable records, left no room for interpretation. For the jury, it was as though someone had pulled back a curtain, revealing cracks in the carefully constructed narrative that had been presented. The power of the moment wasn't in its length but in its precision. In the span of less than 10 seconds, Crockett's defense team had shifted the weight of the trial. What had been a smooth path for Melanian's case suddenly tilted against her. Jurors exchanged glances, reporters began frantically typing on their laptops, and even Crockett herself, who had remained composed throughout, allowed a faint smile to appear as the tide visibly turned. Asterisk for Melania. The witness's words represented more than just a setback in the courtroom. They touched on the fragility of legacy itself, how something built over years could be challenged in an instant. Her side had leaned heavily on the idea that Crockett's remarks had inflicted lasting harm. But this new piece of testimony suggested that the narrative wasn't as one-sided as it seemed. Suddenly, questions arose about whether the lawsuit had been an overreach, a move that might end up exposing more vulnerabilities than it protected. Asterisk. The reaction from the public mirrored what was happening inside the courtroom. News outlets that had initially described Melania's case as strong began to shift their tone. Headlines emphasized the witness's testimony, framing it as a blow to her credibility. Commentators debated whether the trial had already been decided in that brief exchange, noting how rarely such a small moment carries such outsized weight in legal proceedings. Asterisk. Melania's attorneys worked tirelessly to recover, calling more witnesses and attempting to steer attention back to their original points. Yet the staffer's statement lingered in the minds of everyone present. No matter how much they tried to rebuild their case, the foundation had been weakened. Crockett's team, sensing the momentum shift, pressed the advantage. They repeated the staffer's words during cross-examinations and emphasized the clarity of his evidence in their arguments, reminding the jury that truth doesn't always come in long speeches, it can come in a single sentence. Asterisk. What made the moment all the more striking was the simplicity of it. Trials are often remembered for fiery exchanges, shouting matches, or dramatic reveals, but this wasn't that. Instead, it was a reminder of how fragile, carefully managed narratives can be. One well-placed fact, delivered with precision, can carry more weight than hours of argument. Asterisk. In the end, that 9-second moment didn't just shift the courtroom dynamic, it became the defining point of the case. It showed how a single witness, armed with the right piece of evidence, could shatter months of preparation. For Melania, it was a humbling reminder that even the most carefully built legacy can be tested by truth spoken plainly and without theatrics. Asterisk. By the time the trial reached its later stages, it was clear that the case was no longer unfolding the way Melania Trump and her legal team had imagined. What began as an effort to protect her reputation and strengthen her legacy had instead opened up new questions about how she would ultimately be remembered. The lawsuit, meant to showcase her dignity and demand accountability for Jasmine Crockett's words, had exposed the very fragility of the legacy she was trying to defend. Asterisk. For years, Melania had been seen as someone who deliberately avoided the spotlight of controversy. She had maintained a reputation for being private, composed, and selective in what she chose to address publicly. That restraint, in many ways, became part of her identity as First Lady, setting her apart from the turbulence that often surrounded her husband. Filing this lawsuit was her attempt to take control of the narrative, to assert that her image could not be carelessly torn down by public remarks. Yet as the trial played out, the risk of stepping into the courtroom became evident. Asterisk. The testimony that unraveled her case in just 9 seconds had lingering consequences that went beyond the immediate legal fight. Reporters seized on the idea that her legacy wasn't as untouchable as her team had presented. The public saw how quickly a carefully built reputation could be challenged, and that realization reshaped the conversation about Melania. Instead of being seen purely as a dignified figure standing against defamation, she was now being scrutinized as someone whose image depended heavily on perception rather than undeniable fact. Asterisk. Crockett's defense team leaned into this shift, reminding the jury that reputations in public life are often tested by criticism, and that resilience, not lawsuits, is what truly preserves legacies. They framed Melania's action as an overreaction, suggesting that by taking Crockett to court, she had inadvertently given her opponent a larger stage to challenge her credibility. In this framing, the lawsuit looked less like a defense of honor, and more like an acknowledgement that her legacy was vulnerable, enough to require legal protection. Asterisk. The irony was not lost on those observing. Melania had entered the courtroom seeking to silence words she viewed as harmful, but in doing so, she amplified them. The more her legal team tried to paint her as a victim of unjust remarks, the more attention those very remarks received in national headlines. Crockett, who might have otherwise been remembered only for a fleeting moment of criticism, became a central figure in a trial that questioned the durability of Melania's reputation. Asterisk. What became clear was that the trial had shifted from a narrow legal matter into a broader cultural conversation. Commentators began to ask whether legacy is something that can truly be defended in court. They noted how the case revealed a tension between perception and reality. A legacy built on silence and composure can appear strong, but it is also susceptible to collapse when tested in the open. Melania's insistence on drawing a line ended up revealing just how delicate that line was. Asterisk. For Melania personally, the experience was a reminder of how much weight a single moment can carry. She had spent years curating her image, yet it was shaken not by a long campaign of criticism, but by one witness's statement that lasted less than 10 seconds. That vulnerability left many wondering whether her attempt to protect her legacy had instead reshaped it. In the public imagination, she would no longer be remembered only as the First Lady who avoided conflict. She would also be remembered as someone whose effort to defend her dignity in court ended with her legacy being called into question. Even as her attorneys tried to move forward, the narrative of the trial was already fixed in the minds of the jury and the public. Melania's early advantage had been lost, and what remained was the impression of fragility. The lawsuit had been an attempt to draw strength from the legal system, but instead, it illustrated that strength in legacy does not come from silencing others, but from enduring and rising above criticism. Crockett's team capitalized on this point, emphasizing that history remembers resilience more than courtroom victories. In that sense, the trial left Melania with an outcome she had not intended. Instead of fortifying her reputation, the case highlighted its vulnerabilities, raising questions about how she would be remembered in the long run. What she had hoped would be a clear victory for dignity had instead become a lesson in the unpredictable ways legacies are tested and reshaped when exposed to public scrutiny. As the trial drew to a close, the air in the courtroom carried a heaviness that reflected the unexpected journey it had taken. What began as a straightforward case, Melania Trump suing Jasmine Crockett over remarks she considered damp, transformed into something far larger than either side might have anticipated. The lawsuit was intended to be a clear stand for dignity and reputation, but it became a public exploration of how fragile legacies can be when tested under the harsh light of scrutiny. Melania's team had entered with confidence, believing that the strength of her image and the seriousness of the allegations would be enough to tip the case in her favor. For a time, they succeeded in creating that impression. The opening statements, the carefully chosen witnesses, and Melania's composed demeanor all suggested that this was her moment to reclaim control over her narrative. But trials are unpredictable, and it only took one witness, one short moment, to change everything. The staffer's 9-second testimony became the centerpiece of the trial, overshadowing hours of polished arguments. That brief but devastating, the statement didn't just weaken Melania's case, it reframed it entirely. What had once looked like an act of strength began to appear as an overextension, a reminder that reputations built on perception can be dismantled quickly when confronted with simple facts. For Crockett, the trial had seemed at first like a daunting challenge. She was going up against a former First Lady with resources, a legal team, and public sympathy on her side. Yet by the end, she emerged not only intact, but arguably stronger. She had held her ground, and the testimony presented by her side left a lasting mark that no rebuttal could fully erase. Instead of being silenced by a lawsuit, Crockett's voice was amplified, her defense becoming a symbol of resilience against efforts to suppress criticism. The trial's outcome reached beyond the courtroom. It sparked conversations about the nature of public life and the difficulty of controlling one's legacy. Melania had long maintained a quiet, composed image, and for many, that restraint was a defining part of her identity. But stepping into this legal battle showed the risks of defending an image through confrontation. By trying to protect her reputation, she revealed how vulnerable it could be. In the end, the trial was less about legal victory and more about the lessons it left behind. It reminded the public that legacies are not secured through lawsuits, but through resilience, actions, and the ability to withstand criticism. Melania sought to silence words she viewed as unfair, but in doing so, she gave them a larger stage. Crockett, meanwhile, demonstrated how a single fact, presented clearly and without theatrics, can outlast even the most carefully prepared strategies. The story closed not with dramatic outbursts or fiery conclusions, but with a quiet realization. Legacies are fragile, and the way they are defended can sometimes define them more than the criticisms themselves. For Melania, the trial will forever be remembered not as a triumph of dignity, but as a moment when her legacy was tested and, in the eyes of